It began like any other morning in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, calm, steady, familiar. The kind of morning where laughter often mingled with law, where compassion had its own place beside the gavel. The cases before him were light, a missed stop sign here, an expired meter there, small mistakes in an ordinary city. But then the clerk called the next name, Arthur Brennan. An elderly man rose slowly from the back row, steadying himself with a worn wooden cane. The courtroom quieted. His movements were deliberate, respectful, the kind that carried decades of discipline. A faded army jacket hung loosely over his thin frame, its patches dulled by time. His boots, though polished, trembled slightly against the floor as he approached the bench. Judge Caprio looked up with his usual warmth. "Good morning, sir. How are you today?" he asked, expecting the kind of exchange that had brightened so many mornings. Arthur lifted his head, revealing eyes that were both kind and weary, eyes that had seen too much. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said, voice low and rough like gravel. "I suppose I'm just trying to stay on my feet." A soft chuckle rippled through the audience, polite, harmless, but it vanished the moment he continued. "Your Honor," he said again, this time slower, almost whispering, "I didn't come here to argue. I came here because I needed to remember what it feels like to be heard." The air in the room shifted. Even the faint hum of the ceiling fan seemed to fall silent. Judge Caprio's smile faded into quiet concern. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Brennan?" he asked gently. Arthur's lips trembled as he searched for words. His gaze lowered to his hands, hands that had once carried rifles, now shaking as they rested on the podium. "Sometimes," he said, "you fight so long that when the noise finally stops, you forget what peace sounds like." The audience didn't move. The bailiff blinked hard, his jaw tight. Caprio leaned back, the weight of that sentence settling deep in his chest. A routine ticket had just turned into something else, something sacred. This wasn't about a fine or a mistake. This was about a man standing in front of justice, not for punishment, but for remembrance. And as Arthur stood there, his voice steadying, one thought passed through everyone's mind: what kind of pain could lead someone here just to be heard one last time? Judge Caprio leaned forward, his tone softer now, almost like he was speaking to an old friend. "Mr. Brennan," he said kindly, "tell me a little about yourself. You mentioned you came here to be heard." "I'm listening." Arthur smiled faintly, his eyes distant but polite. "Well, Your Honor," he began, "I'm 78 years old. Born right here in Providence. Spent most of my life trying to do what's right." He paused for a moment, adjusting his jacket. "I served in Vietnam. 2 tours. Came home with a few medals and a lot of things I never asked for." The room went quiet again. He wasn't boasting, his words carried no pride, only gravity. "I was a radio man," he continued. "That meant I was the one they tried to hit first. Sometimes at night I can still hear the static, like the jungle's talking back." Caprio nodded slowly, his voice low. "That must have been hard to carry." Arthur chuckled softly. "Hard to put down, Your Honor. You come home thinking you left the war behind, but it's like it found a way to unpack in your own head." He looked down for a moment, fingers tracing the edge of the podium. "Work was never the same after that. I'd last a few months here, a year there. The noise, the crowds, they'd bring it all back." He exhaled deeply, the tremor in his hands now visible. "I married my wife, Margaret, in 1972. She was the only thing that ever made sense. Always said I had 2 wars, one overseas and one in here." He tapped his chest gently. "She helped me win both for a while." Judge Caprio's eyes softened. "You said for a while?" Arthur nodded slowly. "She passed 5 years ago. Cancer. Peaceful, at least. Since then, well, the house got quiet. Too quiet." His voice began to fade into a whisper. "The nights are long when you've got no one waiting at the table." He cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "I still go to the VA every week. Therapy, blood work, checkups, they keep me going, though the bills, they add up. That's where I got this ticket." He gave a small, weary smile. "Parked outside the VA clinic just like I always do. Guess I stayed too long that day. Lost track of time talking to a new guy who just got back. He was 23, said he couldn't sleep either." Caprio looked down at the citation on his desk, then back at Arthur. The paper suddenly felt heavier than any ticket he'd ever held. What had started as a parking violation now felt like a window into a man's private war, one that never really ended. Judge Caprio flipped the ticket over in his hand, his brow tightening slightly. Something about the date caught his eye. "Mr. Brennan," he said quietly, "this citation, it was issued on May 29th. He paused, glancing up. That was Memorial Day, wasn't it? Arthur's chin lowered, his eyes glistening. Yes, Your Honor. It was. A hush fell across the room. Even the court clerk, usually busy shuffling papers, stopped mid-motion. Caprio leaned forward, his tone softer now. Would you mind telling us what brought you there that day? Arthur nodded slowly, his voice low and steady. Every year I go down to Roger Williams Memorial. There's a wall there, not as big as the one in Washington, but it has the names of the boys from our state. Men I knew. He swallowed hard. Some of them I watched take their last breath. He looked down at his trembling hands. I park nearby, take my old lawn chair and just sit with them for a while. Read the names out loud. Sometimes I bring flowers. Sometimes I just talk. His words caught in his throat, the weight of decades pressing down. The day I got that ticket, he continued, I must have sat there for hours. The sun went down and I didn't even notice. I guess I stayed too long. When I came back, there it was, a little yellow envelope under the wiper. He gave a soft, broken laugh. Made me smile, honestly. Felt like life's way of reminding me I was still here. Judge Caprio didn't speak right away. He was staring at the veteran, not as a defendant but as a man standing between two worlds, the one he fought for and the one that forgot him. Why didn't you contest it earlier? Caprio asked finally, voice gentle. Arthur's answer came after a long pause. Because, Your Honor, I didn't think anyone would care. The room went completely still. You could almost hear the breath catch in people's chests. Arthur continued, his tone trembling but resolute. Most people see an old man in a beat-up car and figure he's just wasting time. They don't know that sometimes remembering is all we have left. He hesitated, then looked up, eyes moist but defiant. You asked what day it was, Judge. For most it's a holiday. For me it's roll call. He took a deep breath. Every name I read that day was someone who never got to grow old. Never got to come home. I promised myself I'd keep their memory alive as long as I could, even if no one else did. Caprio's expression softened, the lines on his face deepening. His hand went to his glasses, adjusting them more to hide the emotion in his eyes than to see clearly. That courtroom, built for law and order, had turned into something else entirely, a place where silence carried more truth than words ever could. And in that silence, everyone understood. This wasn't a case about parking. It was about a man still fighting the longest battle of his life, the one inside his own heart. Arthur's breathing grew slower, heavier. His hands trembled as they rested on the podium, the knuckles pale beneath the courtroom lights. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter, thinner, but it carried a weight that filled every corner of the room. Your Honor, he began, eyes fixed on the bench, people think war ends when the shooting stops. But it doesn't. You come home and the noise is gone, but the silence? That's louder. Caprio didn't move. No one did. Arthur's lips trembled slightly as he continued. You try to build a life again. You get a job. You get married. You laugh when people laugh. But inside, it's still there, the sounds, the smells, the faces. His hand lifted, almost unconsciously, tracing invisible shapes in the air. It's the faces that stay with you. The ones you couldn't save. He paused, and for a moment it seemed like he might stop speaking entirely. But then, with a deep, shaky breath, he said, what really breaks a man isn't the war itself. It's coming home to find the world has moved on without you. Caprio swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the veteran before him. Mr. Brennan, he said softly, you said earlier you lost your wife. How long were you married? Arthur smiled faintly, a tired, wistful smile that looked borrowed from another time. 42 years, Your Honor. She was my anchor. Margaret kept me grounded. When I came back from overseas, I wasn't the same. Nightmares, anger, confusion, all of it. But she never gave up on me. Said I just needed a little more peace than most men. He reached slowly into the breast pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small, creased piece of paper. The edges were worn, the folds nearly breaking apart. He unfolded it with trembling hands. I used to write her letters while I was deployed, he said, voice cracking. Every week without fail. I told her about the stars over Da Nang, about the boys who made me laugh, about the ones who didn't make it back. He looked down at the fragile letter in his hands. After she passed, I kept writing. I'd sit at the kitchen table and talk to her on paper. Sounds silly, I know, but it helped. Made me feel like she was still there. The courtroom was utterly still. Even the sound of breathing seemed to disappear. Arthur's voice broke as he added, this is the last one I wrote her. The day before she died. He held it up gently. She told me to keep fighting even when no one's watching. Said that strength isn't about how long you stand, It's about what you stand for. He paused, his throat tightening. But lately, Your Honor, I'm just tired. A single tear slipped down his cheek. The sight of it, that quiet surrender from a man who had seen so much, hit harder than any speech could. He took a deep breath, eyes red but resolute. When I got that ticket, it wasn't about the money. I didn't care about that. I just didn't want to forget. Those names on that wall, they're the only family I have left besides my memories. That's why I parked there. That's why I stayed. Judge Caprio removed his glasses, setting them carefully on the bench. His hand rose to his face, fingers pressing against his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was unsteady, fragile in its sincerity. Mr. Brennan, he said slowly, you've done enough fighting. Arthur looked up, startled, as if waiting for permission to finally rest. Caprio leaned forward, his voice now breaking. You've carried this country on your shoulders long enough. Let us carry you now. The room was silent, but it was not an empty silence, it was reverent. The kind of silence born from respect, from heartbreak, from gratitude that words could never touch. The judge wasn't the only one with tears in his eyes. The bailiff turned away, blinking hard. A woman in the audience quietly dabbed her cheeks with a tissue. Even the clerk beside the bench had stopped writing. And for the first time in years, Arthur Brennan stood in a courtroom, not as a defendant, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as a living reminder that the deepest wounds are the ones the world can't see. For a long moment, no one moved. The courtroom hung in perfect, heavy silence, a silence too sacred to break. Judge Caprio sat motionless behind the bench, eyes lowered, as if weighing something much greater than a verdict. Then slowly he stood. The wooden chair creaked softly behind him, the only sound in the room. Mr. Brennan, he began, his voice low and unsteady, I've handled thousands of cases in my life. I've heard excuses, confessions, even tears. But this one, he paused, the words catching in his throat. This one's different. Arthur raised his eyes, his body trembling ever so slightly. Caprio continued, each word deliberate. You didn't come here asking for mercy. You came here carrying the weight of men who never got the chance to stand where you're standing now. You came to remember them, and in doing so, reminded all of us what honor really means. He looked down at the citation still sitting before him. Then, with a quiet motion, he folded it in half and set it aside. This ticket, he said softly, is dismissed, not out of pity but out of gratitude. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom, followed by complete stillness once more. Caprio's gaze shifted to the crowd. His voice grew stronger, steadier, not as a judge but as a man moved beyond his own role. This man, he said, motioning toward Arthur, deserves more than our sympathy. He deserves our thanks. He took a step back from the bench. Ladies and gentlemen, he said quietly, please rise. The sound was gentle at first, a chair sliding, a shoe scraping the floor, and then all at once every person in the courtroom stood. The bailiff, the officers, the clerks, the spectators in the back, all rose to their feet in perfect unison. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Arthur blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what was happening. His lips parted, but no words came. He looked around the room, at strangers standing tall, at faces wet with tears, and his hand instinctively went to his chest. His chin trembled as he whispered, I don't deserve this. Judge Caprio stepped down from the bench and walked toward him. Mr. Brennan, he said softly, today this courtroom is your home. And you are not forgotten. The old veteran tried to speak, but his voice broke. Instead, he straightened his posture, the soldier in him flickering to life once more. With a trembling hand, he raised it in a weak but proud salute. Thank you, sir, he managed to whisper. Caprio returned the gesture with quiet respect, then extended his hand. Arthur took it firmly, his grip fragile yet full of history. The judge's eyes glistened. No, Caprio said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Thank you, for reminding us what real courage looks like. The applause began softly, a single clap, then another, until the entire courtroom erupted into something raw and pure. It wasn't celebration. It was gratitude. It was mourning. It was acknowledgement that some battles are never seen, and some heroes never stop fighting. And in that room, under the glow of morning sunlight filtering through tall windows, the law bowed to something greater, mercy wrapped in honor. Weeks later, the story of that morning in Judge Caprio's courtroom began to travel far beyond Providence. It started as a small local headline, Judge honors veteran after emotional courtroom moment. But within days it became something much larger. National news outlets picked it up. Television anchors replayed the clip again and again. The frail veteran's trembling salute, the judge's tearful words, the entire courtroom rising in respect. The video spread across the internet like wildfire. On social media, millions of people watched, shared, and commented. Some said it restored their faith in humanity. Others admitted they cried watching it. Veterans organizations wrote open letters, thanking Judge Caprio for something few had seen in years: compassion where bureaucracy had forgotten it. One message, read aloud on the evening news, came from a veteran's widow in Texas. "My husband served in Vietnam too," she wrote. "He passed away last year, but I wish he could have seen this moment." That salute wasn't just for one man. It was for all of them, the ones who came home and the ones who never did. When reporters asked Judge Caprio about it later, his response was humble but full of meaning. "I've seen many kinds of scars in my courtroom," he said softly. "Legal scars. Emotional scars. Human scars. But the ones we can't see, those are the heaviest." He paused before continuing, his eyes lowering. "Mr. Brennan reminded us all that justice isn't only about punishment. It's about remembrance, about making sure people who gave everything for this country are never invisible again." In Providence, something beautiful began to happen. The city's veteran support groups received a surge of new volunteers. Donations arrived for counseling programs and memorial upkeep. Strangers left small flags and letters at the local war monument, each one bearing a handwritten note: "For Arthur." The moment had grown into a movement. As the camera slowly pans across the courtroom once more, the narrator's voice returns, calm, steady, filled with quiet reverence. "Arthur Brennan came to pay a fine," the voice says, "but left teaching us a lesson, that justice is not only about rules but remembrance. That mercy, when shown in its purest form, can echo longer than any law." Then, as the image fades to black, one final line appears on screen: "Friends, if this story touched your heart, share it. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can heal the deepest wounds." And before the last note of music fades, a soft teaser appears, just a whisper of what's to come. In our next story, a child's innocent question leaves Judge Caprio speechless.